So 60 to 70% of small mid-market business successions fail. That's according to leading research. And the reasons for this are pretty simple. First of all, most businesses don't prepare for succession. They just don't put thought into it. They don't really truly plan for it. And second, when they do, they focus only on replacing the existing leader. That's a little bit like saying all that you need to do for a successful heart transplant is to find the perfect brand new heart. Now, I think most people would think that's silly. I think they'd understand that a heart transplant is a complete systemic impact on the body. But when it comes to succession, we often think about it the same way. Just find the perfect new leader, succession planning, done. If succession planning is done at all, that's usually the approach that it is attacked with. In reality, succession is a complex event with broad systemic impact throughout the organization. Identifying the new leader is only part of the process, and it's usually the last part, and that's a surprise to most people. Today, I'm going to show you why a holistic approach to succession planning is critical and the 3 types of succession plans that are actually needed, including the 2 plans that nearly everyone overlooks. Now, beating the odds, becoming part of that 30% or so, is actually pretty easy. You just have to be one of the few who take the time to prepare correctly. And if you want your company to thrive beyond you, this video will introduce you to the Succession360 process. It prepares you for the most likely succession scenarios and the full impact of leadership transition on your organization. So as I mentioned earlier, 60 to 70%, depending on the research that you look at, 60 to 70% of successions fail. And failure has very specific definitions. It means that there's been a forced sale of the organization of some kind or forced closure. It means that there's been a loss of control, particularly for family-owned or some kind of unique entity that owns a business and they lose control of it in some way. It can mean drops in performance of the company. It can mean drops in value of the company. It almost always means a failed succession will mean a drop in, not a drop, but a problem with employee retention. You'll lose some of your key people, which impacts performance and value. And then the last thing is that there's often frustration with whoever's providing the governance of the organization, whether it's owners or a board or whoever. They often feel frustrated to the point of saying, we shouldn't have hired that person. That was a mistake. And so any of those definitions, any one of those is not good. Any multiple of those is awful. You want to avoid that. But that is what most organizations experience, is they go through this very rocky, if they survive it at all, a very rocky experience with succession. And it is avoidable if you put the right kind of plan and preparation in place. There's also 3 misconceptions that I want to address about succession. The first one, and I mentioned this in the intro, is the idea that succession planning is only about finding the right next new leader. And that's not true. I use the analogy of finding the right heart for somebody who needs a heart transplant. Clearly, if you're going to do a heart transplant, it's going to have a huge impact on the body, and the body might not even want to accept the new heart. It's a risky procedure. It's not guaranteed. Obviously, medicine's come a long way, but they've learned how to control or address a lot of the systemic impacts of that scenario. It's not just only about finding the right new heart. And it's the same thing when you think about succession, is that you need to recognize that when you bring in a new key leader, it has a systemic, large-scale impact on the organization, and there can be energy or motivation within the organization to reject the new leader or not know how to absorb or engage with the new leader. And so it's important to prepare for all of those things so that you have a successful experience. The second misconception that's very common is the belief that the outgoing leader should choose their successor. And that nearly always fails. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'll go into in another video. But in brief, they tend to fail because of the fact that successors have a bias. And when they choose, the outgoing leader has a bias towards who they think will be the best at running the company. And the way they tend to think about it and approach it often creates a scenario where they choose people that are good supporters to them or people who feel good to them in some way, but are actually not the right ones to take over. And this is very, very, very common. I do a lot of work with organizations who had a successor who was chosen by the outgoing leader, and the organization is struggling because of that. And working with that can be a very difficult process at times. Sometimes you can turn that around, but many times you can't. And it's just important to be aware of that the ownership group or the board of the organization really needs to be involved in this process. They cannot delegate, should not delegate this out. The third misconception is that succession will happen at the timing and the terms that the outgoing leader is deciding or choosing. Roughly, depending on the research that you look at, roughly about 50% of the time, that's not going to be the case. There is a very high likelihood that death, unfortunately, either of the executive or somebody in their family, that's some kind of illness, that's some kind of conflict that happens within the organization, that they get burned out, that there's some kind of a better opportunity elsewhere and they get drawn away, there's some significant life event or crisis that pulls them away, all kinds of things. But about half of the time or better, your outgoing leader is actually not going to leave under the timing or the terms or the plan that they had. And so you want to have an emergency succession plan in place. That's the first major type of succession planning that I want to encourage that you think about, because it's at least 50% likelihood that that's going to be the one that you're using. Additionally, when you build this plan and you've thought through all of the different decisions that are going to need to be made to make an emergency succession. If somebody's gone, they don't show up to work the next day, and you got to figure out leadership for the organization, and you've already thought through how to do that, most of that thinking and that work directly translates into the planned executive succession planning that most people are expecting and anticipating. And so you get a lot of your groundwork done here. This is very valuable planning for the benefit of the organization. There's 3 different types of emergency plans. I'm not going to go into detail now. I'll have another video on this. But there's one that's specifically for short-term successions, or interim type roles, where maybe somebody has to leave for, I say, under 3 months. So this is a scenario where maybe somebody's getting cancer treatment, or maybe there's a sabbatical type of a scenario, or any other kind of a situation that might pull an executive away for up to 3 months. A short term, how do you fill in a pinch when you don't have a chance to plan for it? How do you fill in somebody for up to about 3 months? Then there's a long-term succession scenario where there's a time frame where the leader will be gone. This isn't as common, but it happens for a time period longer than 3 months. How do you find an interim leader that can fill that spot for that period of time? How do you structure the organization with the understanding and the awareness for both short-term and long-term that that executive is going to come back? And then we have the third scenario, which is a permanent absence. Somebody's just gone. They've quit the job, they've been fired, they've passed away, whatever's happened, they're not coming back. And so how do you work with that kind of scenario? Each of those 3 have a little bit of a difference, but they all build on each other. The long-term builds on the short-term, and the permanent one builds on the other 2. The second kind of succession planning is staff succession. Or this is something that I actually call strategic staffing, but it's to think about staff planning in a way that incorporates the executive succession dynamic into it. There's a couple of aspects of this. For many, many years, most people hired when there was an immediate need. In the current hiring environment, for most industries and most parts of the country, there's exceptions, but for the most part, right now, if you wait to hire, especially management or key technical skilled professionals, if you wait to hire them the moment you need them, it's going to be too late. It's going to take too long to find them, it's going to be too long to onboard them, too long to get them up to speed, and you're going to miss windows of opportunity in your organization. So what you want to begin to do is begin planning for where is the organization going to go, and who are the people that we're going to need to run this future organization. People love to say things like, we want to scale the organization, or we want to create a business that looks like this or feels like this, and they'll create amazingly detailed strategic plans or ambitious plans around how to do that, and they almost always never think about who do we need to have on board and in what roles to make that organization succeed. And because they don't think about that, that's one of the major reasons why a lot of these strategic plans don't actually work. and it creates a frustration. It's because they just didn't see about it. They didn't see that. They didn't think about it. And so that's the second plan that I encourage. This also helps build the organization overall because you're constantly thinking about your leadership and your technical skills bench that you need to have for where you want to go. The third plan is planned executive planning. That's the third plan. And I usually recommend working through these in this order. You don't exactly have to. You could switch these two. I would always start out with emergency planning, but this is the last one. And in most cases, this one only makes sense when you start to get within about 2 to 3 years of anticipating that your senior executive is going to leave. And planned executive planning, if you look through the resources and the tools that'll be linked below in this video, you'll see it's a more involved and more detailed process. Here's the thing about that. People never really want to do a little bit of extra work or more work. And I understand that. I get that. But none of the work that I put into my recommendations is just work because of some kind of academic need. I've worked with many, many organizations, helping them deal with preparation for this or helping them deal with the aftermath of not having prepared for this. And so the recommendations that I make in the Succession360 Toolkit and in each of the videos that I'll have around these topics, the more in-depth videos that will be linked to later, describe things that you actually do need to make this work. Because, again, 60 to 70% of organizations that feel like they're ready for this, that think they can handle it, think they can shoot from the hip and figure it out, will not be able to do that. But planned executive succession usually only makes sense in the last 2 to 3 years, because if you don't have a good sense of who you want to bring on, or you're not ready to begin actively looking for that person, it runs the very high risk of mostly being an academic exercise. And at that point, it tends not to be acted on and not to be fulfilled. And I find it to just frankly be a waste of everybody's time and energy. And so this is the general principle. There's exceptions. Sometimes you've got, let's say, a family-owned company, and Junior is going to run this company, but it's 10 years down the road. And so you've got this growth track for testing and training Junior out. That's a little bit of a different scenario. But in most scenarios where you're looking at either placing this person from within or hiring from outside, I would say typically wait to build this plan out once you're within this 2 to 3 year window. Once you get in this window, then you can start figuring that out and start deciding where you want to go. And you will be covered if you've done these two. Your organization will be in a safe place, you'll have mitigated risk, and you will be ready if an emergency scenario happens and you get kicked into succession planning faster than you anticipated. So there's some benefits to doing this holistic process. I know this feels like a bigger lift than what most people expect, but that's like a lot of things in life. When you watch people that do accomplish something, well, like a great musician or athlete, and they seem so effortless in what they do, it's easy to overlook the fact that they spent hours and hours and years of training and work to be that effortless. And so it's the same thing with succession. It turns out it just is a little bit more involved and a little bit more complicated than what most people expect. And if you approach it well, it actually builds a healthier, more robust organization. And there's a number of benefits that come with that. One is you have stability during change. You don't go through the months of kind of chaos and extra work that are required to carry an organization that has a sudden departure or a poorly planned departure. Incidentally, if you don't do this part well and you bring in the new executive, those are the ones that really heavily feed into these executives that leave within 18 months. And then so you almost are guaranteed to have an emergency scenario down the road. And so these things play off of each other if they're not done well. You're not likely to be able to grow your own internal replacements if you don't have a good staff succession or strategic staffing plan. You can actually increase the value of your company by good planning. People that are interested in the risk of your company, like lenders, like bonding agents, like other people in those industries, they become very interested in knowing, have you actually thought this stuff through? And if you have, that is favorable to you and can actually end up saving you money or give you access to more leverage. You have better retention in the organization. You can build clear career plans for staff, which is encouraging them and supports retention. And it gives more confidence to the owners and the board through the process. Succession planning can be a very, very positive, affirming, strengthening process for the organization. Because succession has a systemic impact, that's the scary thing, it also has a systemic benefit when it's done well. So I want to encourage you to really embrace the full process, look at the Succession360 Toolkit, and that will help. Building a holistic succession plan ensures that your business is prepared for today, but more importantly, ready for tomorrow. You'll find the links below to the free Succession360 Toolkit. That includes everything that you need to ensure that your succession will be successful. And part of making that plan work is knowing where to start. And that's why in my next video, I'll walk you through the first and most important type of succession planning. That's the emergency succession plan. It's the most important part because about half of successions happen under duress in an emergency context. After that, I'll cover staff succession planning and planned executive succession. You can find those in the links below. That way you'll have the full picture of what's needed for a complete succession planning process. But you can start with the emergency succession plan video right here.